His greatest story.
Zobo kept Nelly safe in his pocket all the way home. When he entered the house, Nelly could feel warmth from a fire and could hear a young girl's voice call her brother to the table. Zobo set Nelly down on the table and stared at him over his plate. "Don't worry, you are safe here," Zobo said to Nelly. "I rescued you from Bart so I can hear the end of your story." Nelly's mouth fell open in surprise. "What story? When did you hear my story? I don't understand," he stammered. Zobo laughed. "The story about the sloth, who is the prince of the land called Rainforest," he said. "I have been listening to all your stories every night from the loft in the barn. I love them. That is why I rescued you from Bart. You are far too good a storyteller to be turned into fire." Nelly laughed because he couldn't believe his good fortune. His laugh died as the sister returned to the table and saw him. "Zobo, a matchstick! Give it to me to put it in a safe place. If this fire dies, we will need it to start another fire." Zobo was faster than his sister, and he snatched Nelly before she could. "Imala, no! This matchstick is my friend. He's not for burning. He's a storyteller. Come and listen to the wonderful stories he tells." Imala looked skeptical, but as Zobo was younger than her and she was responsible for him, she decided to humor him and she listened to Nelly. He was a bit nervous, fearing that if his story wasn't good enough for the sister, he would be put aside to light a fire. But when he finished his tale, Imala clapped and asked to hear another one. It was decided that Nelly should live with them and tell them a story every evening while they ate their dinner. They found a safe place for him to sleep, in a metal matchbox with a flame engraved on it, tucked away in a corner. So the three of them lived quite happily into summer. Nelly wanted to travel again, so he would never run out of stories. So he and Zobo spent hours planning new lands and places for them to visit when Zobo was old enough. Before too long, however, the summer nights gave way to cool nights that turned into cold nights once again. Matchsticks became scarce once more, and Imala had a difficult time keeping their fire going at all hours. She and Zobo were very poor, and during the day they both had to work tending sheep to make enough money to survive. They took turns coming home to keep the fire going. One day, while tending sheep, Zobo climbed a rock to rescue one of the sheep, and he slipped and fell. He hit his head so hard that he didn't wake up, and the men from the town carried him back to his home and placed him in his bed. Imala brought Zobo to the doctor, who told her that Zobo needed to be kept very warm and that she should talk to him constantly. Perhaps her voice would wake him up. Imala did her best to keep the fire warm and talked constantly to Zobo during the day, while Nelly talked to him during the night, and yet still he slept. After many days, Imala knew she had to return to tending the sheep, as they were running out of money to buy food and wood. She had to work twice as hard to keep the fire going when she wasn't home, and Nelly talked to Zobo all day and all night. Imala would fall asleep each night listening to Nelly's stories of faraway places, wishing for a warm place with plenty of food. Days passed, and still Zobo slept, and Nelly was getting worried. Imala looked very tired, and his voice was beginning to crack from all the talking. He had also run out of stories, and he was worried Imala would treat him like the sheep did and want to turn him into fire. But Nelly wasn't going to run away from his friends. And one day, as he retold the story of the Sloth Prince, he looked up on the table and saw a loaf of bread. No one is quite sure what happened in that moment, but Nelly suddenly began the most wonderful story that night about the dreaded pirate, Breadloaf Bran. You have probably guessed that Nelly's storytelling didn't stop there. He looked everywhere in the room and through the windows, and every time he saw something, from a leaf to a tall oak tree, to a cloud, to a spoon or bowl, the most incredible stories sprang to his mind and out of his mouth. Imala had a hard time sleeping at night, for she wanted very badly to listen to Nelly's stories. Even Zobo showed improvement, for he had taken to moving slightly in his bed, or smiling whenever Nelly told him a new story. One day, however, there was an accident with the sheep, and Imala didn't make it home in time to tend the fire. Nelly was so busy talking about Thunder, the chocolate cloud, who rained chocolate chips down on Istanbul on Christmas Day, that he didn't notice the fire dying slowly behind him, or that Zobo was starting to shiver violently. He had almost finished the story when he looked at Zobo, and then he looked in horror at the fire. Without a thought, he jumped up, ran to the door, and ran down the road to find Imala. It was getting dark, and this saved him from being seen. Since Imala knew his voice, she heard him calling her, and she came running, scooping him up in her hands and headed for their house. As she opened the door, she could feel the cold air and saw Zobo shivering on his bed. The fire had died, and Imala burst into tears. Nelly looked up at her sadly. "It is my fault, for I was so busy telling my stories that I did not notice the fire was dying. Now there is no warmth for you or poor Zobo, and he may die." Imala looked at him through tearful, sad eyes. "It is not your fault, dear friend, for I too did not have time to think of the fire because of my fear for the sheep." Nelly bowed his head and stayed in silence as Imala's tears fell in her hand around him. His own eyes were filled with tears when he looked up at her. "Get as much wood as you can. I shall make a fire for us." Imala sobbed loudly and hugged him closely. "I love my brother, and I have come to love you, and we will find another way. He would never forgive me for taking away the only other one in this world who cares so much for him, the matchstick storyteller who brought so much light to his life. There is no other way. You are not taking me from him, for I am giving myself," Nelly said calmly. "There is nothing for him to forgive. I shall become my own greatest story, and this will not be the end, dear Imala. I will always be in your heart. Every evening, when you eat your supper, you will remember me and my story. You have but to share it with others, and I will live again." Imala stopped crying and wiped her eyes. "We have very little in our lives, and yet we met you, and your stories brought a light and a warmth that is better than any fire. You took us to places we could never hope to go, and helped us see the things in the world in a magical way," she said. "I promise we will not let your fire die, or your light leave our home. May our land be cursed and all who come here die frozen if we fail in our promise." With those words, she kissed Nelly gently. She gathered the wood, and Nelly placed himself back in her hand. "Say a prayer quickly, Imala," Nelly whispered, "for I need courage for myself and hope for Zobo." Imala said a quick prayer, and then, with all the grace she could muster, She gently struck Nelly against the metal tinderbox he slept in. Nelly felt a great warmth rush through him, and he smiled as the flames danced on the wood. "Farewell, and remember me, my dear friends," he called to Zobo and Amala. As he burst into flames, a tear from Amala's cheek fell into him, and he turned to ash. As the ashes met the fire, there was a blue flash, a soft sigh, and the room immediately filled with warmth. Zobo stopped shivering and sat up in his bed. He saw Amala's face, and he saw the fire, and he knew. She hugged him while they both cried. That evening, as they ate their small meal in silence, from the flames of the fire, they could hear Nelly softly telling them his stories even still. Amala and Zobo did not fail to honor their promise to Nelly. They tended their fire faithfully, though it seemed to have some magic in it to help them, for it did not burn nor need tending like any other fire. At night they would listen to Nelly's stories coming from the flames, and tell his greatest story to anyone who would listen. In time, word spread, and people from all over the land and other lands came to hear the story. If they should, by chance, take some of the fire to warm their home, they found the fire would burn all winter. In time, Amala and Zobo grew old and passed the magic flame to their children, and so it continued for many years. The town of Matchstick was built around their home, and their home has always been the heart of our town. We must always take care to tend our heart's fire, lest our land fall under Amala's curse. We must always listen to his greatest story and tell it to others. The children were very quiet when Mick finished the story. "Mr. Mick?" asked a small girl. When Mick looked at her, she pointed to his fire, dancing merrily in the darkness. "Is that Nelly's fire?" Mick smiled and nodded. "It is. Now you all know why we don't have a single matchstick in Matchstick. If we faithfully tend our fire, it will never go out."